Good afternoon, everyone. This is Yasser Munif, and I'm one of the organizers of this webinar series. And we are happy to start shortly the eighth panel of the series, which is about the Kurdish struggles for liberation in Syria and the region. And this panel is the eighth, and we'll have, I'm trying to get the bio, my apologies. We'll have 3 speakers and a discussant. But before we do that, I want to thank the sponsors for this webinar, the Emergency Committee for Rojava, and the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, and finally Solidarity, which is, I'm trying to find the entire name, and for some reason I had the bio, but when the video started, I just it's just went live, and I lost the bio. I wanted to introduce the discussant and the chair for this panel. And I will get the bio just in a second. Thomas Schmidinger is a political scientist and a social cultural anthropologist, and teaches at the University of Vienna and the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria. He is co-editor of the Vienna Yearbook for Kurdish Studies. Research focuses on religious minorities, the relationship between state and religion, the Kurds in Iraq and Syria, and the Yazidi in Sinjar. Latest English publication, The Battle for the Mountains of the Kurds, Self-Determination and Ethnic Cleansing, the Afrin region of Rojava, at Auckland 2019, and the Ontology Beyond ISIS, History and Future of Religious Minority. And I wanted to also show the his 2 most recent books, Rojava, Revolution, War, and the Future of Syrian Kurds, and this book, Battles for the Mountains of the Kurds. Thank you, Thomas, and welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. Good evening from Austria, or good afternoon to the United States. I'm sitting here in the mountains of Austria while discussing with you these important questions. But let's immediately start with the first presentation. I want to introduce you to Kamran Matin, a senior lecturer in international relations at Sussex University in the United Kingdom, where he teaches international history, international theory, and Middle Eastern politics. He is the author of Recasting Iranian Modernity, International Relations, and Social Change, published in 2013, and co-editor of Historical Sociology and World History, Uneven and Combined Development over the Longue Durée, and also wrote several articles and op-eds on Kurdish politics. I'm looking forward to listen to his presentation as the first speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Yasser. Thanks, everyone, for being here in this webinar, and thanks for the organizers of the webinar for the opportunity given to me to speak here. The focus of this webinar is on Rojava, the Syrian Kurdistan, but we thought it might be a good idea to situate the struggle for liberation and self-determination in Rojava in the broader history of Kurdish struggle for freedom in the region. So I'm going to try in 10 to 12 minutes provide a historical background and context to Rojava's current revolution. And I'm going to do that, try to do that in terms of an interrogation of the very common usage of the term the Kurdish question, in quotation mark. I'm trying to challenge the pacification of the Kurdish agency which this term involves, and I'm trying to do that by looking at the longer history of the attempted subordination of Kurdish people in the region, and the ways in which they have responded to this by their own struggle for liberation and self-determination, of which Rojava is the latest and arguably the most progressive and radical expression. So some of the things I'm going to say unavoidably might be repetition for many viewers of this webinar if they are familiar with Kurdish politics and history, but I try to bring some analytical content to the otherwise the historical narrative I'm going to present. So you know, the Kurds obviously have been inhabiting the region of Kurdistan for many thousand years, and this is not the place to go and discuss that longer history. What matters is that the more modern, the more recent history of the Kurds, which who basically up to early 16th century, from the early 16th century, basically lived in the regions controlled by two contending empires in the region: the Iranian Empire, the Safavid and subsequently Qajar empires, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, the fact that the Kurdistan as a geography, as a geopolitical region, and as a people was sort of divided between these empires, had certain implications for Kurdish principalities, which more or less acted as semi-independent entities in these empires, because they were on the boundaries or the frontiers between these two empires. They could extract political concession from these respective empires in return for their loyalty in the course of geopolitical competition, which always existed in different degrees between these two empires. This meant that the Kurdish principalities, which existed in both Ottoman and Iranian empires, enjoyed quite high level of autonomy. And this partially explains the speed and rapidity with which the modern Kurdish national movement emerged, because the memory of these earlier, more or less semi-independent period was quite fresh. So if you fast forward to the early 19th century, this kind of broadly confederal structure of these empires, within which Kurdish principalities had high level of autonomy, came to change, because these empires, facing the pressure of European empires, began to transform their own state and political and economic structures. The most important of these changes was the centralization of the empire and the state. And this centralization meant to take away the autonomy, the freedom which these Kurdish principalities, and there were quite many of them, enjoyed. So this attempt by the center to take away these freedoms and autonomy obviously led to the reaction from these Kurdish principalities. And here we are seeing the first wave of Kurdish, if you like, rebellions and revolts against these attempted centralization by the imperial center. This process, though, took a sharp turn by the early 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War and the collapse of the empire, and the way in which the European empires basically divided the territory of the Ottoman Empire. So by 1923, Lausanne Treaty, suddenly Kurds find themselves in 4 states rather than the 2 empires in which they previously lived. In the Kurdish literature, usually it's referred to this partition of Kurdistan into 4 different parts as the second division of Kurdistan. The first being the 1514 Battle of Chaldiran, which divided the Kurdistan between the Ottoman and the Safavids. Now, what is significant about this second division is that these new states emerging out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, they embarked on constructing nation states which were unitary in structure, in the sense that all these states, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran, they created the notion of their national identity and the structure of their state in terms of one particular culture and language and identity among so many others which existed in these geographies. So this particular culture and language was, in case of Iran, Persian, in Iraq and Syria, Arabic, and in Turkey, Turkish. So this meant that the Kurds, like some other populations in these empires, found themselves suddenly on the margins of power and economic power and wealth and political rights and wealth, power, and obviously launched their own national or nationalist or national movements to kind of overcome and fight this subjugation by this national states. And these movements basically has been going on for at least 100 years, as we know, and it has taken different ideological and political forms. In very, very broad terms, we can identify 3 main streams of Kurdish resistance against this national subordination. One is what I would call a classical nationalist movements, which have sought to create a Kurdish state in the image of their own oppressive states. I mean, not necessarily to replicating exactly their internal structure, but in terms of idea that statehood is the only remedy for Kurdish colonial situation in the region. Then you have what I called, others might call it differently, a revolutionary socialist movements, which have existed in different parts of Kurdistan, in some parts more dominant and more stronger, in others maybe less so. And here we have a conception of Kurdish self-determination, which is closely linked to a broader project for a socialist revolution, in which capitalism as well as nationalism are problems to be removed, and that the real Kurdish freedom is achieved through a socialist transformation. There is a much smaller stream of Kurdish politics which has emerged mostly since maybe in late 60s and 70s under the influence of Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt and elsewhere. So there is an Islamist movement in Kurdistan as well, but as we know, and everybody familiar with Kurdish politics knows, that they are broadly quite a minority. Now, what I want to say here is that this division of Kurdistan into 4 different parts has created 2 different kind of dynamics. One is international, one is transnational. By international, I mean those phenomena and dynamics which emerge because of this geopolitical fragmentation of Kurdistan. So, for example, all these 4 states which contain Kurdish population have had different geopolitical orientation in different times. So, for example, during the Cold War, Iran used to be in the international division of politics on the Eastern Front, whereas Iraq was closer to the Soviet Union. So that meant that Iran and Iraq were had geopolitical friction and problems, and this created a space for Kurdish movements in both sides of the border, so to speak, to try and exploit this geopolitical competition to their own ends. And I want to suggest that this division of Kurdistan is actually the reason for this recurrent phenomenon in Kurdish history, that one or the other Kurdish movement finds itself in a tactical alliance with this or that regional states or international power. The reason being that this division has reduced the balance of power in each state in favor of the ruling state and to the detriment of the Kurdish population and the politics. So on their own, kind of drawing on their own resources and power alone, they are unlikely to be able to affect any change or reach in a favorable balance of power, which therefore pushes them towards this international tactical, and I insist on the tactical side of the term, alliance, which tends to not to unfold in the way in which it's expected, because the state actors which come into these alliances, like United States in Syria now, or Iran in the 1970s with respect to Iraqi Kurds, or Soviet Union in respect to the Iraqi Kurds again, they actually do these alliances in terms of much broader geostrategic considerations, in which the Kurds do not feature that much. So this idea of Kurds have no friends but mountains is actually an expression of the political effects of the geopolitical division of Kurdistan. It's not intrinsic to the Kurdish politics as such, or to the Kurdish culture or history. It's quite international in character. On the other hand, this division has also transnational effects, which I want to talk about now, and that is the notion that there are phenomena which exist despite this division of Kurdistan into geopolitical parts, meaning that there are different tempos, there are different impulses in different parts of Kurdistan, which are not synchronized in historical time. And that means that the resources, the achievements, the cadres, and the experiences of Kurdish movement in one part can actually transcend these borders, which have been created by essentially colonial powers and preserved by these semi-colonial states, and actually be deployed in different parts. So, for example, in early 80s, when I was in Iranian Kurdistan, many members of Kurdish movement, radical leftist Kurdish movement in Turkey, in Bakur, they came to Iranian Kurdistan after revolution because there was this Kurdish opening in Iranian Kurdistan. They were actually trained, and they brought with them their own ideas and the organizational techniques, the discursive kind of material. And this had actually quite big effect subsequently on the developments in Bakur. Similarly, the Iranian Kurds in 60s and 70s were influenced and inspired by what was happening in Iraqi Kurdistan. And the Syria, similarly, in Rojava, uses on the accumulated experiences of Kurdish movement in Bakur, in Turkey. So there are these two different dynamics at work, and one can look at a particular configuration of this dynamics in any given historical moment to actually get to quite, I would say, satisfactory explanation of particular developments in different parts of Kurdistan and the problems which different movements have faced. And I think I'm getting close to my time. I don't know, maybe I've already taken too much time, but I want to conclude on Rojava because that's what we started with. So I mentioned this classical nationalist tendency within the Kurdish movement, and we have also this revolutionary socialist tendency. I locate Rojava movement and the project of democratic confederalism within this wider and longer history of revolutionary socialism. What is distinctive about the democratic confederalism is the fact that it no longer simply abides by the broad and relatively abstract notion of self-determination, because self-determination can take any form. A people might determine that its future is secured best through a state or through autonomy or through federalism or whatever. What democratic federalism does is to provide actually a concrete answer to the so-called Kurdish question through a non-statist formula. So democratic confederalism in effect is a non-state solution to Kurdish national question. And it's non-statist because it identifies nation-state not as a solution, but actually as the root cause of Kurdish plight, if you like, in the sense that just as Turkish, Iranian, and Syrian and Iraqi state have created all this suffering and repression and kind of confiscation of freedoms and rights of different peoples within these states, a Kurdish state might well actually end up in the same direction, and therefore actually Kurdish autonomy and freedom and liberation is served best by a form of political organization in which state hierarchy plays no role. Now, this idea of going beyond the state obviously has other corollary premises, such as a radical feminist agenda in order to kind of arrest and prevent the statist impulse of patriarchal structures which have existed and exist in the region. But also there is an ecological side to it, in the sense that late capitalism obviously has brought the world into a brink of destruction because of its destruction of ecology and environment. And no democratic society can actually go on and ignore this problem, and therefore a ecofeminist and radical democratic society needs to be at peace and conscious of its ecological environment too. So in that sense, I think democratic confederalism as a political project is sort of unique in Kurdish history. Now, I mean, people may have all sort of criticisms, and I might have my criticism as well, but it doesn't detract us from the fact that it's an extremely ambitious, it's extremely potent and fertile, in the sense that actually it in a way, in principle, overcomes the very geopolitical division which I described as the cause of the kind of disfavorable imbalance of power which Kurdish movement has enjoyed over the last 100 years, because it allows a kind of transborder or transnational forms of solidarity around the idea of local communes which have this horizontal rather than hierarchical kind of connection with each other. I think I will stop here, but I'm sure there are blind spots in my talks which people might want to ask in the question and answers, and I'm more than happy to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kamran. We will have time to discuss and to elaborate that in the discussion, where we will discuss all three papers together. So thank you for this first introduction to the topic. And I think this lays a good bridge to the next speaker, actually. Dlshad Othman, he is himself a Syrian Kurdish activist and a specialist on information technology in information security. Dlshad works on investigating state-sponsored cyber attacks, and he's currently working for a major Silicon Valley company. Dlshad holds an MSc degree in computing, and currently he studies for LLM in computer laws at UCL and Queen Mary University in London. Welcome, Dlshad. You will present us now a specific Syrian Kurdish perspective on the Kurdish revolution. I'm looking forward to listen to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. In my presentation, I will be actually speaking about personal opinion of how the relationship between Kurds in Syria and the Syrian Revolution developed in the past 9 years, where it started, where it's ended today, and how complicated is the situation. So what I'll be talking about is a reflection of really personal feelings of 9 years that I went through, and it shaped my opinion about the issue. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, as I'll be presenting some visuals that will help me also organize my ideas. 1 second. All right. I guess you can see my screen now, so I'll just go ahead and start presenting. Yep, it's a complicated relationship, and it started very smooth. It started as an answer to a call, which was March 2011, when the Syrian Revolution started. At that time, I remember I was in Damascus. I was participating in a lot of activities within the activist group. They started to form or organize themselves, and Kurds had really good experience with peaceful demonstrations and peaceful, let's say, organizing and solidarity movements, things that they learned from 2004 uprising, which happened in Qamishli 2004. But at the same time, we knew how harsh is the regime and how brutal can the Syrian regime be when you face the regime with a peaceful movement. So Kurds were concerned a little bit about the 2011 movement because they knew how harsh is the Syrian regime. Now, exactly at that time, at the beginning of 2011, when Kurds joined the Syrian Revolution and they became part of the movement, the regime was really smart. The regime did not escalate it in any Kurdish region. So I remember in Damascus, the longest protest that I participated at was less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes, you will regroup, regime is going to attack. But I was in Damascus in May, in Qamishli, I'm sorry, in May. And I participated in protests that actually stayed for 2 hours. No one from the regime showed up. So the regime played on hey, let's not attack minorities, but focus on majority, which is Arab Sunnah. And actually, this has started make things more complicated. The no U-turn day for me was when this activists, they called one of the Fridays, which was May, I think, they called it Azadi, which means freedom in Kurdish. And I think at that stage or at that time, lots of Kurdish activist groups, they became actively participating in the Syrian uprising in general. Lots of youth groups started to organize themselves. But at the same time, as Kurds started to get visibility within the movement as a kind of unique group that are participating in the uprising, lots of concerns from the other sides also started to raise. And I remember I was in Damascus, it was May, I was participating in a conversation and lots of people were asking me some suspicious question. I was like, why do you hold the Kurdish flag if there is a Syria flag, for example? And questions that they were leading to actually a more complicated future, which is identity. I think the first really wall that the Kurds hit politically within the Syrian Revolution movement was when the Syrian National Salvation Conference took place in Turkey. It was July, early in the days, movement was still peaceful, and the Kurdish bloc actually left the room and they rejected to participate in the conference. And the reason was because the night before they agreed that, hey, Syria's name should go back to pre-Ba'ath Party era, which is the Republic of Syria. But they rejected the day after. Actually, during the Salvation Conference, people were shocked because they saw that actually the title was Syria Arab Republic, and in the statement they were saying Syria is an Arab country. So lots of identity clashes started to happen at that time. Also, one of the issues that actually it started to make it clear that there is an identity crisis that's coming is when the funeral of Mish'al al-Tammu, late Mish'al al-Tammu, happened. That was October, I think October 17th, 2011. Mish'al, as a Kurdish leader, they put the Kurdish flag on his casket, but actually the mainstream pro-Syrian revolution population were really upset because why the Kurdish flag why not the Syria flag? Again, lots of identity issues. But at that time, we were like, hey, we're learning, we're getting to know each other after 40 years of disconnection. So it's fine. This is a healthy conversation. But I think one of the most serious points that we had was when FSA, Free Syrian Army, entered Ras Al Ain, and that was November 2012. At that time, lots of Islamic groups, including early days of al-Nusra, Ahfad al-Rasul, Ghuraba al-Sham, they entered Ras Al Ain city. And Kurds have an issue with Islamic armed groups. Like it's something we really grow up hearing. Like, hey, the minute that someone tells you, hey, we're Muslim brothers, whatever, that means there is a scrutiny coming. And I think same applies to armed groups. Kurds had a really bad relationship in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan with Islamic groups and armed forces. So for Kurds, it was a red flag. And I think that was the first time when we were like, oops, I don't think we agree on a lot of things politically. But also something really bad happened. And this is a video. I don't think I have a time to show it. But the Free Syrian Army teared apart the Kurdish flag when they entered Ras Al Ain. And that was like really, again, a big moment for Syrian Kurds in general. Jihadism in general is an issue, and Kurds have an issue with jihadis taking over almost every aspect of the movement. Muslim Brotherhoods are politically in control of the pro-Syrian revolution political bodies, let's be honest. Majlis al-Watani, Itilaf, all these bodies were still controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is a big issue for Kurdish political groups and in general, public in general. Also, early in the days, 2012, 2013, donors like Gulf countries played a role in actually pushing the Islamization more to make it a branding for FSA. And that also created more barriers between Kurds and the Syrian revolution. Saddam, many times Free Syrian Army actually formed brigades and formed like armed groups, and they called them Saddam after Saddam. So imagine like, hey, me being pro-revolution or pro this green flag, and I see a brigade that actually holds Saddam Hussein's name, or a Free Syrian Army cars holding Saddam Hussein pictures. And this actually led to a lot of tensions again. This is a tweet from a very prominent, let's say, Syrian opposition media figure. And literally he tweeted a couple of days ago saying, like, you cannot compare Bashar al-Assad to Saddam Hussein. Saddam is way better than Bashar al-Assad. So again, issues like this made it really complicated for me as a person to actually be part of this movement. It was Ras Al Ain when we started to really hear about YPG. YPG was formed prior to that in 2012, but it was on a small scale, most likely linked to PYD, more than being like a Kurdish armed group. But when Ras Al Ain happened for the first time, I felt like there is a local alternative that actually can prevent jihadis from coming over, but also take over Syrian government when they leave or if they get kicked out from the area. And I think in 2012, in 2012, they became more stronger. And for Kurds, who is actually witnessing lots of issues on the other side, that was a local alternative that it might be acceptable, regardless of anyone's political background. Like, yes, it's linked to PYD, but at the same time, it's a Kurdish group that actually we can work on and improve. Turkey got more involved in the political aspect of the Syrian revolution. This is not a secret. Like since day one, the Salvation Conference took place in Turkey. The Majlis al-Watani was formed. The Syrian National Council was formed in Turkey. Itilaf was formed in Turkey, and Turkey really owns the political life of the Syrian revolution. And this is a big issue for us. For many times, they rejected PYD from participating in any initiative. And for me, it's really not just PYD, but you're rejecting one of the largest Kurdish political parties from being part in the future of their country. And this is a big issue for me, regardless of him being pro-PYD or not. And I think this was a big red flag again. On the other side, also, the Syrian nationalism, like it started to take place. And unfortunately, Syrian nationalism really relies on erasing other, let's say, identities within the region. So the actual conversation about identity was dominated by the Syrian nationalists, and this is again a big issue. One of the events that actually made it more complicated too, and this was really personal because I had friends in in Sheikh Maqsoud in Aleppo country. Sheikh Maqsoud is a neighborhood in Aleppo. Majority Kurds lives there, and it was under control of YPG. And end of 2015, Free Syrian Army was shelling Sheikh Maqsoud using actually home gas tanks and stuff like that. Lots of people died, and it was really awful. For me, it was, there's no, like, that's it. There's no U-turn after this. And the Syrian Revolution, or the mainstream actors that control Syrian Revolution, they are becoming enemies. And that was the end of 2015. And I think for the rest of the Kurds, that was also, that's it. You know, we cannot accept this anymore. And personally, it was really painful, because lots of friends, activists that I was going out with, doing activities with at the early days, they were silenced, or they were actually pro these activities that they took place in the first place. After that, it got more complicated. And one of the largest issue was Kobani. When Kobani was almost gonna go under ISIS control, I was just browsing my Facebook, and everyone was making jokes and fun of Kobani. Kobani took lots of publicity on media. And I've seen some jokes, like, for example, one of the individuals that I really worked with for years posted, like, hey, guys, do you know that Syria is located beneath Kobani, which means, like, hey, Kobani is taking bigger publicity compared to the actual crisis, which is Syria in general. And that was like, gosh, it's really getting too bad. Also, there was lack of solidarity. I mean, you would talk to well-educated individual who are liberal to the left, kind of political leaning, and you would ask them, what do you think about what's going on in Kobani? And the answer is like, oh, it's going out of YPG to ISIS. Doesn't matter. No big difference, and stuff like that. And that was, again, a big issue. And it got more complicated, it got more worse. Again, as I said, since 2015, I felt like we're dealing with enemy more than partners in the movement. And I think Afrin made it clear, especially the day they destroyed the Kawa statue in the streets of Afrin, and they raised the Syrian flag, Syrian Revolution flag. And this is a very symbolic, and it means a lot for me, to be honest. The anti-Kurdish sentiment started to take place after Afrin. We've seen the displacement of almost 300,000 Kurdish individuals. And on top of that, for the first time, Turkey started to push Turkmen ethnically, Turkmen ethnic armed groups to control Afrin and to lead this kind of displacement. So a new identity issue, which is Turkmen versus Kurd crisis, Turkmen versus Kurd, started also to take place after Afrin, and made things more complicated. And recently, the Peace Spring operation, which for me it's personal, because for a month I was just trying to help family to get to a safe place, and that was like, you know, yes, for the past 5 years I've been building opinion that is different from what I had in 2011, but now it's personal. Now it's really hitting the private zone of my opinion. And I think that's when you would see the Kurdish mainstream opinion would accept ideas like, hey, let's talk to the regime, let's talk to Russia, they're better than these guys. And I think that's made it obvious where we are standing now. Again, this was personal presentation about the process of how I should build my own opinion, but also reflects the mainstream Kurdish street and how they view things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dlshad. I think this is a very good example, actually, not only for your personal development, but I agree that this is a mainstream story of many Kurds that witnessed the development of the last years. Thank you very much. We will discuss that also afterwards. And now we have the third presenter with us, Ozlem Göner. Welcome. She's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island. She earned degrees in political science and sociology from Boğaziçi University in Turkey, Istanbul, and her PhD in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her work on memory and historicity, political economy and environment, and outsiders' identities has been published in academic journals and edited volumes. Her book, entitled Turkish National Identity and Its Outsiders, Memories of State Violence in Dersim, was published by Routledge in June 2017. She is steering committee member also of the Emergency Committee of Rojava, and this is her book. Yes, thank you very much. And she will speak now, as I learned, about mainly the women movement and the gender politics in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the series that organized this important connection, important conversation, I believe, between the Syrian revolutionaries and the issues of Kurdish self-determination. As Kamran put it, has many, many multiple ways to think about it. And I'm also very glad to have heard the history of this solidarity and the problems with it that was experienced, particularly with certain opposition groups. So I just want to recognize that. But I think, you know, part of the reason that Rojava took so much attention was, and part of the reason that, you know, people talked about it and it became mediatic in a sense, with the fact that a lot of women were fighting against ISIS, were struggling. You know, there were pictures of YPJ guerrillas holding guns and succeeding against ISIS, which was a great resistance and resilience movement against patriarchy and against capitalism and state oppression that Kurds have experienced in their history that Kamran explained clearly here. But I believe that we need to engender that history some, and we also need to look into why Kurdish women were able to attain such important roles in Rojava Revolution, and why they were able to not only participate in a national revolution against the states that repressed and oppressed them, but towards a more egalitarian, just society that is anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-state at once. So I believe that women's revolution in Rojava has a very long history that can actually be dated back to the women's struggle and survival against the state violence in the early history of colonization of the Kurdish populations. Because one important engendering lesson that we need to do in understanding the Kurdish history is that as these regional colonies, mainly colonizer countries, namely Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, as they have colonized the Kurdish populations that were then by Europe, by Great Britain, and to some involvement of France, were given under the control of these nation states, as they colonized them, massacred them, try to displace them, and try to assimilate them in various forms under these different repressive regimes, that they have also used gendered state violence in many of the Kurdish geographies. For example, one that I have worked closely on is the memories of state violence in Dersim. We have seen these fractured of women's resilience against particular oppressions, such as rape and sexual violence against women, and also the stories and memories and narratives of women having to abandon their children, women being forced to give their children to the armies that have taken control of these lands. So it is a very gendered story of oppression. But that is why, you know, women are not only the victims of this history of Kurdistan, but they've also been agents of struggle and change in the Kurdish geographies to an extent that is unforeseen in many ways. We can date it back again to 1930s and the early 1920s and 1930s to resistance and resilience of these women who have survived and who have survived state violence and who have survived their identity, Kurdish identity and language against the colonial forces who have tried to oppress and assimilate them. But then another major revolutionary movement, and my narratives mostly are from Bakur, and then I will, go back to, I will conclude with Rojava and talk about why the women's revolution in Rojava, why Rojava is not just the Kurdish revolution. First of all, it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious model of democratic confederalism that has gone beyond Kurds at this point, but it's also a women's revolution in Rojava that needs to be recognized and understood historically. So I'm gonna look into then the Kurdish women's freedom movement, which we can date back to early 1920s and 30s in these fractured forms of consciousness, of resilience, of survival in even these earlier history of massacres in the Kurdish geographies, the larger Kurdish Middle East. But its actual movement form, that form that it took that's more organized, that's more systematic and has developed a systematic critique of the systems that have oppressed the Kurdish societies, can be dated back to the late 1970s, where Kurdish women started to be involved in the leftist movements first. And this is, I think, a very parallel history exists here to the history that Dlshad was explaining to us, that the Turkish left could never recognize, the majority of the Kurdish left, with some very little exceptions, could not recognize the problem that the Kurdistan is a colony, and that the any leftist revolution should address that and should put this in the center. That was always to be resolved later category. And another problem within the Turkish left was the problem of patriarchy, that many of these movements were led by men, and there was very little room to talk about patriarchy within the movement and to talk about a societal change that not only addresses and reverts class issues and anti-capitalist movement, but also one that is socialist, but at the same time feminist. So this was not recognized among many of the leftist movements. So the emergence of one of the ideological founders of the movement in Rojava that we're familiar with is the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, that was founded in Turkey in the late 1970s. And there were the involvement of many women started during this period. And though there needs to be a differentiation made here, because obviously women were involved in leftist socialist movements or identity-based separationist movements in other places as well. So I'm not suggesting that this is unique. But what was unique is women were able to put the issue of patriarchy at the center of their revolution. And so this started in the late 1970s, but took an important, it got strengthened, especially in 1980, when some of the leaders of the Kurdish women's movement, women leader of the Kurdish women's movement, mainly one of the most important ones of this was Sakine Cansız, who was imprisoned in the infamous Diyarbakir prisons, where women prisoners founded the early states of the Kurdish women's movement. Their resistance against the dehumanization of political prisoners and dehumanization of women prisoners especially have been crucial for the development of a women's movement within the PKK. And as they resisted this dehumanization, as they turned the shame that the Turkish state tried to inflict upon them as Kurdish women, they reverted to the state itself and the patriarchal, oppressive, and capitalist state structures that have oppressed and put them in prison. So their resistance against this dehumanization became a very important narrative, a very strong narrative, and also it created a very strong movement within the Kurdish liberation movement. So when we talk about the PKK and the Kurdish liberation movement, there is actually a parallel women's movement that is developing within this. So this is very different than women only being involved in a Kurdish liberation movement. This is women creating their own movement within this movement and struggling against the patriarchal structures within their movement and putting the question of patriarchy and the critique of patriarchy at the center of their revolution, which that part of their involvement has been unique. And this has many reasons. As I said, women's resistance in Diyarbakir prisons, Sakine Cansız's resistance especially, have been quite important for this, and she's one of the main founders of the PKK. But also Öcalan, who is the guide of the Kurdish freedom movement, has also been sympathetic and has also put the question of patriarchy at the center of the Kurdish movement. And so, with his support, the Kurdish women developed a struggle that's simultaneously against capitalism, since they had this leftist socialist trajectory that they were historically part of, against state violence, which dated back obviously to the early colonization of the Kurds and the earlier gendered violence against Kurdish women in particular, and also patriarchal structures that existed within their own communities and their own movement. So in the 1990s, the Kurdish women's movement got especially stronger. And why? One of the reasons is that the Turkish state, the war between the Turkish state and the PKK got intensified, and the Turkish state opened a war against civilians, displacing millions of civilians out of their villages and towns. And during this process, also implying various forms of gendered violence against women, and for example, using the guerrilla bodies, the women guerrilla bodies as sites of colonization, displaying the naked bodies of the guerrilla as a factor of fear in the Kurdish movement. It created a larger resistance than the Turkish state expected. So by the mid-1990s, by the late 1990s, women started to be 40% of the PKK, and not just in numbers, but they have developed a very qualitative change in the movement. And for example, in 1995, which I think I should share for you to understand the history of this Kurdish women's movement, the PKK declared a resolution concerning the women's army and the free women's movement, which states, again, this is 1995, this is not 2020, this statement stated, in quote, "The potential of women who make up half of the society in the service of the revolution, and their hidden and suppressed talents and intelligence in creating an entire society based on equality, is the most humane and the most radical characteristic of our revolution." So in 1995, earlier on, that they started to put patriarchal and an anti-patriarchal feminist revolution at the center of their revolution. And this resolution in 1995 was very important because it did grant independence to women's organizations, and it also proposed that all women units, and this is why we have YPJ in the larger PYD, the all women's units this was an important step because they think that self-defense, and this is also an important notion to understand in the Kurdish women's movement, the self-defense against both the oppressive state and against those patriarchal remnants within the Kurdish society and movements is going to be very important for the strengthening of the women and for women to develop their own structures to hold the all gender units accountable. So this idea started earlier in the mid-1990s and became more concrete in 1995. But you know, I want to also say that none of these were given to Kurdish women. As women, they gained these through struggling not only against the Turkish state, but their male comrades. But the movement became very strong and very rich in the 1990s because in the guerrilla, women's units started to be created and gained more power. And also in the more civil society, you had Saturday mothers, for example, revealing the paramilitary violence against the revolutionaries and villagers by looking for their lost relatives, to peace mothers who have asked for the Turkish state to sit and to make peace with the PKK, and also HDP, which is the Kurdish, pro-Kurdish party that has taken many names in its history because it was always suppressed and closed down and reopened under a different name. HDP also became a strong force. So what we have here is then a very rich and deep women's tradition and women's liberation movement within the Kurdish movement and Kurdish liberation movement. But again, these were not given to Kurdish women. They have to fight, and they have to fight within their movements as well. And a good example of this is Gülten Kışanak's discussion of the long struggle within the Kurdish political party, which results with women's victory in 2007 in Turkey, in Bakur, Kurdistan. Kışanak was active in the prisons resistance of the Diyarbakir prisons and has been active in Kurdish women's freedom movement. And when she arrested on false charges of supporting terrorism in 2016 and was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months in prison, she was the co-mayor of the city of Diyarbakir. You know, the reason that I'm quoting these is also, I wish that Kışanak was here. You know, sometimes it's like, while we are building solidarity, it would be great to have some of these, obviously, who are very active in their movements, but we know the reasons the Turkish state has been committing feminicide and has been especially targeting women within the Kurdish women's movement in more harsh ways in terms of their imprisonment as well. But I want to share a quote from her that shows the struggle within the struggle, that shows this revolution within the revolution, the women's revolution, women's liberation revolution within the larger Kurdish liberation movement. So she says that in 2007, men in the Kurdish political movement accepted the number of women to be elected. So men finally accepted that women need to have some power within this movement, but they came out with a new offer to put a few famous women or the wives of famous men on the list. According to our male friends, that would have been easier for society to accept. They also, you know, the movement itself put forward the society and the Kurdish society not being ready, but that wasn't actually the problem. The problem was that the men wanted to hold on to their power positions. But we said no. So this is very important, you know. For women to struggle for the rights that they gained, we were strongly against accepting a few symbolic women. We wanted to exist and make decisions at all levels. We also decided that female candidates should not be decided on by men or in joint meetings. Women's organizations should decide on their own candidates. After long and harsh arguments, we won this battle. We created a women's election committee in parallel to the previous general election committee, and women's branches decided their own candidates. And almost all of our women candidates had more votes than their male colleagues. their message was much clearer, and society was ready, even if the previous male-dominated power holders were not. So, you know, I don't want to go on too much longer, but the important thing to understand here is that from earlier colonial history to the later women's involvement, Kurdish women's involvement in leftist movements, to later Kurdish women's involvement in Kurdish movements, that they have created a separate Kurdish women's liberation movement within their own movement. And this is the foundations of what we saw in Rojava. And this is not, you know, as Kamran was saying, that it's not that the ideal has been reached in Rojava. It's an experiment, it's in practice, it's messy, but the movement has gained, the women's movement has been very powerful in creating new dynamics, a new society, new gender egalitarian society, a new feminist movement, a feminist revolution in Rojava, where they have implemented in their social contract the quota, the co-mayor system, women's involvement in the communes, women decision-making process, and all women units that will always be responsible and that will have the full authority in deciding matters that concerns women's bodies and rights. So these, you know, there's a lot to say on the Kurdish women's movement, there's a lot to say on Rojava revolution, but that these have been important accomplishments that have been gained over 5 decades, if not more, long struggle against state oppression of the colonial states, against capitalist structures that have commodified women's bodies, that have imposed different patriarchal restrictions on women's bodies, but also against their own movement, where the male power holders tried to hold on to their power. So women's struggle is ongoing and have been successful in many ways.
Thank you very much for this talk. And sorry for the church bells in the background. I'm here in the mountains and I hope it doesn't disturb you. Before we come to the questions that were asked already on social media, I wanted to use the chance to ask you a question, Ozlem, concerning how these struggles were transformed to the situation in Rojava. Because you told us a lot about the feminist struggles also inside the movement in Baku. And I think one of the most important steps was also to establish own female structures within the party that could be used for the struggle with patriarchy inside the PKK and the Kurdish movement. However, all this happened in the setting of a guerrilla movement, and of course later also in the setting of a legal party as well. The situation in Rojava is completely different to that, because a territory was taken over in 2012 more or less without an armed struggle, and later on there was an armed struggle against the jihadist groups. So there was a nucleus, not maybe of a state, but of a self-administration set up. And this is a completely different environment. So if you compare it to a guerrilla movement, and I guess that this has consequences also for the way a feminist movement can struggle within that structure. Can you reflect a little bit about these differences between the guerrilla situation and the self-administration in Rojava?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the history of the movement itself dates back to earlier, which means that when we come to Rojava, certain pedagogy and certain ideology is already in place. So that's one of the differences, because, you know, obviously Anyone who visited Rojava has seen pictures of Öcalan as being accepted as, the ideologue and the leader of the Kurds. And so his ideas and writings and the feminist struggle, and that has developed over time. But by the time that the revolution has taken place, that certain the social contract was being written, that certain things were taken for granted. And one of them was that our movement is one that's going to be struggling against patriarchy as well as the Syrian state. So, I mean, even in Bakur, and that's why it's not just guerrilla movement, right? PKK has never been just guerrilla movement. We know that it's a transnational movement. We know that there's, some of the earlier, also, I didn't mention this, didn't get the time, but some of the earlier women's success and gains and conferences started in Europe. So that it's been, a very widely geographical and in terms of civil society, organizations, political party, guerrilla, that we have a very rich, vibrant conditions. But there are differences, definitely, but the important thing has been that the ideology of the movement, and at least the person who's thought of as the ideological figure, and the women's movement that have gained a certain status and rights by that point when the Rojava Revolution took place, were already gains that the women's movement have made. So there has been less struggle in Rojava, and women were able to, by that point, attain a much more egalitarian social contract than basically even the rest of Western Europe or elsewhere. So there are, many differences, and there are multiplicity within this movement. It's not a singular movement, but that the pedagogy of the movement, the democratic confederalism idea, and also the pillars of democratic confederalism idea, the pillars of ecology, the pillars of feminism, and the pillars of anti-capitalism, which is formulated in different ways, right? In the early foundations of the PKK and the development of the movement, it was considered to be socialist, and that term has taken different forms. I don't think it has been abundant, as some argue, but that there is a lot in the movement. But the pillars of the Rojava Revolution by 2012, 13, 14, and also obviously the attacks by the ISIS necessitated that the women became also fighters, and they had no other option as well. But when women became fighters, they had already this idea of separate women's units that was implemented and used in the PKK, in HDP, in European, so it was certain pillars were implemented and applied and practiced in many places over the larger Kurdish movement, I would say.
Thank you very much. Now I will mention some of the questions that were raised in social media to some of the participants. The first question was directed to Kamran, and the question is, isn't democratic confederalism a step back from the perspective of a united free Kurdistan, I would say in brackets state? Isn't it a concession to oppression of regional states? Come on.
Yeah, well, I think I can say two things here. One is statehood is the form of national sovereignty. It's not its essence. So, or rather the framework. So if a framework can secure Kurdish nation or any particular people's ability to decide its own affairs in a democratic and free way, I don't think it matters if it's called a state or not. And, I don't know, Switzerland or Scotland here in the UK or Quebec in Canada, I think they are good examples. And in all cases, they can, in any given time, to go independent, and yet they choose not to because they think it gives them, they benefit from the current arrangement. So I don't think state in and of itself it's something to be sanctified, or in and of itself is normatively superior to other forms. The second issue is that let's say if this is a concession, so what about the Kurdish movement, or the branches of Kurdish movement who are wanting or pursuing an independent Kurdish state? Where have they got? So we have to ask why after 100 years that project has not been successful. And I think the reason is very objective. It's not that Kurds or Rojava or the PKK or whatever leftists don't know the concept of independence or sovereignty. They know very well, but the geopolitical fragmentation, the international legal structure which has emerged since Second World War and also First World War, these are all against the formation of Kurdish state, and we see this all the time. In 2017, Kurdistan, independence referendum in Iraq, the way that the United States have allowed, and in fact, I would say engineered Turkish invasion of Rojava, the 1975 incident in Iraqi Kurdistan, all this show us that, however noble one might consider the idea of a Kurdish state, there are objective geopolitical and international barriers on it. On the other hand, the discourse of radical democracy does not have the same level of provocation, if you like, to the existing international institutions and discourse, and in that sense might simply be even pragmatically an option which might have a better chance. Now, I would, for my own part, say that the states which dominate the Kurds at the moment, they are as much opposed to a Kurdish state as they are to democratic confederalism or any form of Kurdish self-determination. So I don't think that changes anything with respect to the actual states which dominate the Kurds, but the discourse might have a different effect with respect to the international environment, right? So for most Europeans, the idea of nationalism or nation state basically means Nazism these days, right? So it's not strange, therefore, if a discourse of Kurdish statehood does not attract the same level of sympathy or empathy in the international arena, if that's what the Kurdish movement is trying to seek. So I think whatever other criticisms one might have of democratic confederalism as a project, and I have written on it on my own, for my part, I don't think the idea that it's a concession in comparison to independence is a correct one, because as I said, the state is the framework, is not the content. So if democratic confederalism secures the ability, the right of self-determination, then so be it. It doesn't make it, effectively different with a difference with statehood.
Thank you for answering this question raised by Fabio Bosco. There's another question now for Dlshad, also raised on social media, and this question implies some criticism. The question means, I'm sure through the experience of Kurdish struggle of liberation, Kurdish revolutionaries have their own encounters with problematic and unrepresentative leaderships, bracket PID and others, bracket. On what basis did Dlshad choose to show us public figures who are Arab or Syrian nationalists, mentioning organs representing the bourgeois opposition to the Syrian regime without classifying them as fifth columns against the common interest of both Syrian revolutionaries and Kurdish self-determination and liberation? Dlshad.
Sure. I think at the beginning of my presentation, I said that this is my opinion. This is my experience. So definitely, I mean, PYD committed lots of errors and mistakes and made things more complicated at early in the days. And I'm not denying that. But personally, what really impacted me is the points that I mentioned in my presentation. And I think here we should I should mention something. I still remember, and pictures are, you can search them on the internet. I don't think protests in Ma'arat al-Nu'man, in Idlib, and other little towns here and there in Idlib that actually shows supports to Turkish operations in Eastern Euphrates are bourgeois. This is like, I don't think so. This was a mainstream public opinion who is still pro-Turkey in a lot of parts in the actual movement, let's say, of the not bourgeois groups in the Syrian Revolution. We're talking about elites, individuals, we're talking about journalists, we're talking about public opinion who is pro-Turkey and pro what Turkey is doing in Eastern Euphrates. But also regarding the points of not mentioning PYD, mistakes and errors, again, that was my personal opinion and what impacted me. PYD did things, and I voiced my opinion in many places prior to that, especially on arresting activists or cracking down on other Kurdish political parties in the region. But this has nothing to do with my political opinion and how I view the Syrian Revolution today.
Thank you very much. You answered also at least a part of the next question we got for you, Dlshad. There was also some criticism that you did not mention human rights violations by YPG and PYD and things like that. So you answered a lot of that already. Let me add also something. People who read my books know that I really carefully try not to talk to YPG and PYD alone, but also to talk about other Kurdish opposition parties who are rivals of the Rojava project. And there's often a strong struggle between the NKS, so the parties that are pro-Barzani, let's say, that we simplify it that way, and the self-administration. However, this narrative that the Arab opposition somehow betrayed a common cause against the Syrian regime by allying themselves with first the Islamists, and by getting the funding from the Gulf states, and then allying themselves with Turkey, is a common narrative that even is shared meanwhile by many of the anti-PYD figures, and some of the parties of the NKS even split because the leadership of these parties were not strong enough in their denunciation of the Turkish aggression in Afrin and in Serikaniye. And I think this narrative you presented is a narrative that goes far beyond the supporters of the PYD, PKK, and the way Turkey dealt with Kurdish civilians, and the way these pro-Turkish militias dealt with Kurdish civilians in Afrin and in Serikaniye caused a protest also by people who are strongly against the PKK, just because their relatives suffered as well, you know. So at the protests, even here in the diaspora in Europe, in October 2019, people who supported the Democratic Party of Kurdistan, the sister party of Barzani, also joined the protests of the pro-YPG people, at least in Vienna, this was the case. So I think this, to a certain degree, the narrative you presented here is also a narrative that could be seen in anti-PYD circles as well. Just to add that.
Just to one point, Thomas, here. I personally am not aligned with PYD and its school of ideology at all. I'm from a very Kurdish nationalist, let's say, family historically, and this is how I grew up. For me, Kurdish flag was the Kurdish flag, not what PYD is raising. So I was actually totally in the other side of PYD, the opposite of PYD. At the beginning of the days, I actually signed on petition that asks PYD to stop cracking down activists in our region. But hiding under, like, in the comments, there was people are putting the problem as if it's Syrian opposition against PYD. It's absolutely not. When you take over Afrin and you kick out 300,000 Kurds, when you take over Eastern Euphrates and you remove any Kurdish writings, when you tear apart the Kurdish flag, when you prevent the Kurdish language, when you tear down the statue of Kawa. There are a lot of things that has nothing to do with PYD, but I think it's an easy shortcut for lots of people who are pro-Syrian revolution to justify the actions of FSA and other political groups that are part of the Syrian opposition. I lost lots of friends because of a very basic argument like, hey, FSA took over Eastern Euphrates because of PYD and what they were doing to the people. And I think this is an easy shortcut. They're trying just to remove any responsibilities, any ethical responsibility from being pro groups that are actually committing crimes.
Thank you, Dlshad. There are two things that were mentioned in one of these questions that were criticizing the Syrian Democratic Forces. You might still want to comment on that, Dlshad. One was that they think that YPG cooperated with the regime in Sheikh Maqsood, and that the attacks on Sheikh Maqsood were an answer of the Syrian opposition. And the other thing was that the aid to Nubla and Sahra. You want to answer to some of these local problems.
2 points. One, claiming that Sheikh Maqsood or YPG in Sheikh Maqsood was pro-regime. This is so. What happened is YPG did not support FSA in Aleppo, but they did not go against them. And this, I mean, it's a big difference. Like, why would you support actually FSA that it's pro-Turkey and actually they ended up kicking out Kurds from Afrin? So I think their judgment at that time was absolutely correct. Those are not groups that you need really to support, but they did not support them. I'm sorry, they did not go against them by supporting Assad. This never happened. The other point is regarding an armed group, which was FSA, and they were in Raqqa. They're called Suwar Raqqa, Jabhat Suwar Raqqa, I think, yeah. I mean, again, this is an SDF policy. SDF wants one flag, one leadership, that all goes under. And I think this particular group rejected to be part, to become an actually part under SDF, and they were raising the green flag, which became personally for me a flag that I would really reject too. And I think that's where the conflict started. Let's not forget FSA is used to forming groups right and left and having tons of other groups have different flags, different leadership. And this does not work with the SDF model. And I think it was, it happened under the American pressure. And it has no chauvinist or racist approach. It's not like, let's take out Arabs from SDF, because the majority of SDF now are Arab. So it has no racial background. It's more just an organization kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm sorry, many of the questions are directed to you, Dlshad. There's another question from Fabio Bosco now, who raised the first question already, and I want to read it for you. Dear Dlshad, don't you think Assad, together with the Turkish-Iranian regimes, are major enemies of Kurdish liberation? Shouldn't us stand for the unity of the Kurdish people and the Syrian Revolution in order to fight back faster and reinforce the necessity links of both oppressed people, even facing obstacles posed by the Turkish regime and Khaliji influence in the Syrian National Council and the Syrian Revolution? Isn't that a strategic error of PID, which now have an uneasy alliance with the US and were on the verge of giving Rojava back to Assad.
Yeah, I mean, the word unity is just, nah. I don't think any Kurds who's attending this this conference would accept it. We've been hearing these words for the past.
I'm just reading the question.
Absolutely, absolutely, I get it. No, I don't think unity is going to work anymore. In my opinion, the Kurdish issue is totally a separate case that has no solidarity from any part that Fabio mentioned in his question, but also add to this, I don't think Kurds are supporting Assad. Like this is just a big let's say claim that has no roots. Not fighting Assad at this time does not mean that the Kurds are supporting Assad. Again, why would I just open another front with Russia and Assad? I mean, Syrian opposition are not opening fronts with Assad. Why would I open a front with Assad now, where Russia is on our borders, and a person like Trump is in the White House who changes his mind every couple minutes? I think politically PYD, as someone who's not pro-PYD, I think politically PYD is playing it correctly. At least, again, personally, that keeps my family safe at this time. And I don't think it's a good idea what Fabio is mentioning, or even applicable.
Okay, Ozlem, you wanted to comment on that as well, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think this is, this is an interesting and expected debate, I would say. But the point here is to think of, also somewhat about the future and how we could build solidarity. And I think this type of constant, obviously PYD has made mistakes. All movements make mistakes. All groups make mistakes. PKK has made mistakes in Turkey. But that didn't change the fact that PKK has become a Kurdish liberation movement that was against the century-wide, century-long oppression, suppression, colonization of the Kurdish populations. So once PKK became that symbol to the Kurdish people in Turkey, and this is interesting because I was just at a panel yesterday, and because I go in more detail about the problems of the Turkish left and the Kurdish movement, that I got attacked by Turkish left, right? Because it is, this person is a progressive and calls himself progressive, a communist party member, but doesn't accept the fact that Kurds were ethnically cleansed and colonized in Turkey, and the only way that the Turkish left and the Kurds can make a solidarity movement, which exists with some branches of the Turkish left and Kurdish movement. The only way to make this is to accept that colonization and to be very careful about the privilege that the society, the insider society, had during the period of colonization and during the periods of oppression of the Kurdish populations. So there cannot be solidarity without that recognition and without commitment commitment towards anti-colonization that exists in all of the colonizer societies, and not just in the minds and at the hands of the oppressive regimes, but those insiders who have been benefiting from the colonization of the Kurds under these different parts of the Middle East. So that is, I think, very important. And obviously we can focus on this mistake and that mistake and not support it. And I'm an academic, I'm trained to be critical of movements, that's in training. But at the same time, what are we offering? What are we offering instead? So for example, one of the questions that's been bugging me for a long while is being the blame of the Kurds with working in cooperation with imperial forces, such as the US. Well, you're being attacked by Turkish air forces, and because you have been colonized, that you have never been able to have your own large-scale military and army and air forces, so you cannot defend yourself. And so what are you going to do? Die? Which they have in millions. I have studied 1930s. This is my hometown of Dersim. Tens of thousands of people were killed, raped, and also exterminated at the hands of the Turkish state, used by the air forces, airplanes, and weaponry that Turkey got from Europe. And now Turkey is in great deal and partnership with the US and Europe in terms of getting its armament and getting, so why not using this anti-imperialism to critique the cooperation between the imperial forces and the regional empires that have colonized and ruled and oppressed and killed and massacred the oppressed populations. For example, I'm pretty sure that the people who are in Syrian opposition would be sympathetic, more sympathetic to the Palestinian case. Does that mean that Palestinian Liberation Army didn't do mistakes? Did we look deep into the case? Or do we just have this solidarity because we know their history of oppression and struggle against the Israeli regime that has been in cooperation with the US? Are we going to blame and abandon them when we realize these mistakes? So this is, I think, there is like movement, solidarity questions. There are also ethical questions that people in the opposition that have been insiders of the colonizer regimes that have benefited from the colonization of the Kurdish populations in their lands need to think of before they get into a long critique of the, I mean, we can all criticize, but I think it always needs to be constructive at the very least when you are raising it against colonized, against oppressed, massacred group of people who are trying to self-defend at the face of all these attacks from different regimes.
Thank you, Ozlem. Before I come to my final question to the three of you, there's another question directed to you, Ozlem. Do you think Syrian and Kurdish activists in exile have any better chances for unity of action away from home and from the divisions that are imposed by the tactical and strategic difficulties of the status quo?
I mean, I think so. Because I think one of the problems is our populations have been pitted against each other by these oppressive regimes for over a century now. So it's not the population's fault, but it is the oppressive regimes that have oppressed the outsiders in even more deeper and suppressive ways than the rest of the society, but they've oppressed the rest of the society too. This is very similar to the US, right? I mean, if you think of other examples, I think one of the positive aspects of living in diaspora and looking at, our homes from away is this understanding of these issues from other angles, such as from right now in the US, I'm in New York right now, and there's the Black Lives Matter movement that's on the streets. And any solidarity that's coming from the white Americans to this movement needs to think of white privilege and many other things that goes along with that. So, and this movement, movements abroad, gives us a chance to see the problems with global capitalism, to see the ways that these oppressive regimes have pitted our populations against each other, right? Just like the case with Israel and Palestine, that there's this narrative that's being trying to construct it as if the problem is one of religion, as if the problem is one of, Jewish versus Muslim societies. And because this is how it's being represented from an Orientalist angle. But we buy it. We have been placed in it, in our lands, and we've been pitted against each other. So taking a step back and seeing the intersections of capitalism, of colonialism, of patriarchy, and seeing how we can collectively operate against these, but always self-questioning, self-critiquing, and also especially from the perspective of the insiders of a particular society, to always not speak on behalf of the outsider, to have the, and this happens a lot in our geographies, that this is, I don't want to take, I don't want to dominate the panel, but those are some words I can say. So, yeah, I mean, I think Thomas is not here. Okay. Okay, to this question, I'm going to say, I don't know if anyone saw Muslim Addi, the leader, one of the leading figures of the SDF, talking about Assad regime during the height of coronavirus. And this is, a very small fracture of power relations on an everyday scale. That, Rojava was denied coronavirus test kits. And they were asked to negotiate. Those of you who are asking about negotiation with Assad, since they don't have any autonomy and they don't have any international recognition, that they need to negotiate with the Assad regime even to get their coronavirus test kits. And so during this period, Mazlum Abdi wrote a letter saying that, in our discussions, necessary discussions with the regime, that we never would abandon the ideals of our revolution, and we would never abandon the ideals of autonomy and self-determination of our people. I mean, those of you know that the Assad regime have suppressed the Kurds. Obviously, they're aware of this, and the only reason that this takes place, and I think there are solutions to this, that if we create a global transnational movement, among each other that is claiming other mechanisms of power, because we know the UN has not been supporting and has asking the Kurds to negotiate with the Assad regime. So these geopolitical factors, geopolitical power relations that Kamran was talking about earlier, has really put us in these positions, not because we want to, not because these leaders want to. And they know, Mazlum Abdi knows that if Assad actually gains control of this, he will be in prison. So, I mean, we're aware of this. So given all this, I think the fact that for survival and for self-determination, the Kurdish movements were made by the regional and international imperialist forces to negotiate with those who oppress their people in other parts of Kurdistan is a pity that needs to be worked on by all of our involvement and support, so they don't need that, I think. Because otherwise, I think it will happen again, because they would put protection of their people first. That's what I would put. I'm a mother. If ISIS was at my door and Turkey's attacking me with airplanes, I would go to Assad. I mean, I would go to Erdogan, who's like, suppressed, especially people, Kurds in Bakur, in such harsh means. But that survival of the oppressed is a form of resistance that unfortunately, sadly, happens in these forms in the absence of our solidarity, in the absence of a global movement that could address and that could make us more powerful altogether.
Right. In the absence of Thomas, I'm asked to read this question. So this question says, first of all, I want to sincerely thank you for such an informative webinar. As a Kurdish woman coming from minority of minority, Rojava is one of the few hopes, if I don't say the only one, which keeps me optimistic of the future of my kid. I have a question from Ozlem, for Ozlem. What would be the transferable practical lessons or solutions to the other part of Kurdistan, I suppose, which the women is a topic with multi-layers complexity from law and government perspective. So Ozlem, I think the question is what experiences and lessons Rojava holds for other parts of Kurdistan and Kurdish movement and feminist movement in other parts of Kurdistan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things would be that, this long struggle of the Kurdish women's movement is one that requires, and this is something that, for example, feminists in Rojava say to other people who are like, how can we support you or how can we learn lessons from you, is to replicate the dynamics, try to replicate them in other parts, such as the quota system, such as pushing for a women's liberation within the liberation, such as, like the question of imperialism, the question of the left or the progressive left, how they've always made the Kurdish issue a background or something to revisit once we deal with this, has been the case with the women's issue and patriarchy as well. Let's first do this revolution together and we'll address your questions after. And this has never worked. So that is why Rojava is a good lesson that these need to take place together. Because I think, it also brings about a different understanding of feminism that's not just about women's rights, but about women liberating the society at large against all these oppressive structures of capitalism and patriarchy and oppressive state structures that work together. Because otherwise, there's many other women's movements that are more liberal, that are focused on women's rights, issues of domestic violence. All of that matter, but at the same time, it needs to grow into a more systemic analysis of what are the structures that oppress women and how can we push these structures and change them in our own societies.
Thank you, Ozlem, and I'm sorry that I had some technical problems. Now, let me try to ask all of you a last question and edit also with a small statement. We talked a lot about unity now, also between Kurds and the Syrian Arab opposition. However, I think there's an interesting discussion also going on about Kurdish unity in the recent months, because there were a lot of attempts to include the other Kurdish political parties of the Kurdish National Council in the self-administration. Actually, the United States played a role as an intermediator, and especially Muslim Kobani played an important role in this question.
I think we lost Thomas again.
Yeah, I think we lost Thomas. My apologies. I'm stepping in. I think I'm going to conclude with a similar question that Thomas was asking, which is, the rationale for this webinar and for this series was to explore ways in which people in the region, whether they are Kurds, Arabs, different ethnicities, different religion, could build alliances among each other. And I think I would like to push back a little bit against this narrative that many of the Syrian were opposed to the Kurds, that most of the Syrian agreed with the opposition, the political opposition. I was in Syria many, many times, and what I saw was a rejection of the political opposition, that political opposition that is very closely allied to Turkey, to Qatar, to Saudi Arabia. So the question is, what are some of the ways to think about these strategies among Kurds, Arabs, different religions, from below as opposed to from the top, as opposed to political parties and with interest and with alliances with different countries and so on, but rather think from below, what are the possibilities for alliances, for rethinking politics otherwise. So this is a question for everyone, and I think we'll conclude with that. And my apologies for the connection with Thomas. I'm not sure what was happening, but Kamran, I think that if you could say a few words, because I think.
Oh, right. Well, it's a very difficult question to ask an academic who is like sitting in his ivory tower here in UK, away from the concrete struggles on the ground. I think the first thing is what Ozlem referred to, and is this notion of recognition. If different actors in these movements, in these areas of conflict, do not recognize the kind of projects or the ideas or the demands raised by in this particular case, the Kurds, I think that would make any next concrete step for kind of collaboration very difficult. I remember early on in during the Syrian Revolution, at least part of the opposition to the Syrian regime was refusing to, concede that in the future Syria after Assad, they would remove the word Arab from the official name of the Syrian state instead of Arab Syrian Republic, given that there are so many obviously non-Arabs in this country. And even on that point, at their kind of weakest point, they would not kind of budge. So what I mean by recognition, if that is not recognized, then it's very difficult either for SDF or PYD or anybody to actually get into collaboration. But I would also want to echo what you said, Yasser, that there were a lot of radical progressive leftist elements within Syrian Revolution who had very good relations and cooperation with Rojava movement. And I think that's, for example, the coordination committees, if I remember correctly. So this is the kind of foundation on which we can build. But I would also say that in any movement of this scale, ultimately there are material interests, there are class positions which determine and shape any particular groups or people's or parties' positions. So I don't think we can't be too ambitious about how much unity or united front can exist. What we can do is identifying the common denominator which every single progressive, broadly democratic movement actually has, and build on that. And I think that applies as much to relation between Kurdish and non-Kurdish movements as it applies to Kurdish movements itself, within which, of course, we have all sorts of Kurdish politics and ideologies and doctrines and so on. So I think, at least me as an academic, probably Ozlem is more involved than me, but I think we can identify in abstract terms these kind of principles, but it's really for political activists or leaders on the ground to concretely assess in which particular conjuncture which slogan or demand has the broadest appeal, because that's the only way we can actually mobilize the social energy which we need to deal with extremely powerful and repressive states, right? So in that sense, I think obviously, the word democratic and democratic confederalism is quite crucial, because ultimately, radical democracy or democratic equality of different groups and entities and populations and languages and cultures and politics is the first, I would say, the launching pad for anything beyond that. But I think the second and probably coeval element is the conversation which has to take place. And I would say we haven't had probably enough of that. And one thing, everybody referred to potential mistakes of Kurdish movement or SDF or the PKK. For me, the main issue at stake in this regard with respect to Kurdish movement is reflexivity, is about self-criticism, which has to be open and public with regard with whatever policy or, I don't know, even bigger issues. I personally haven't seen enough of this, but it's not for me sufficient to, on that ground, then reject the movement as such. I think every movement learns in the course of the struggle and in the concrete circumstances. So yeah, common denominator, broad democratic discourse and ambitions, and reflexivity within the movements involved in the conversation.
Ozlem or Dlshad, any concluding remarks?
Well, that's, I guess one of the one example that already took place in Rojava, which is not called Rojava anymore because Rojava is a Kurdish name. So they changed it to Democratic Confederation of Northeast Syria for a reason, because there are many groups that live there. And they didn't give up the idea on Kurds or rejection of Kurdish oppression, decolonization of Kurdish societies, but they realized that the nation state, in the forms that it has been practiced, and the nation state is not just a state structure, it is a factor in capitalism, it has worked in its relations with the ruling elite, and the ruling elite has been from the insider, so with monopoly. We know the problems with the nation state. So the problem was recognized, and then the solution was then a democratic confederalist model that is from below to the top. Now, what will you call that top? I'm not necessarily calling it a stateless society, and I'm not necessarily arguing for that, because I think until a stateless society around the world is created, that the nation-state structure is still in place, then you need to be recognized in order to, have certain power in the international power relations, such as when the US actually decided to take its troops out of Syria. It said, well, we're not going to have these groups, because they didn't have a name, they didn't have a nation state, in the peace negotiations, because they're not an official state. And so this was the continuation of that colonization process that had left Kurds stateless. And so some level of autonomy and recognition becomes necessary, but their critique of the nation state holds on very tight in our possibility and potential of solidarity and going against the geopolitical nation-state structures that have pitted us against each other. So that is why that critique is very important. And that is why we can see the example of Rojava, where at least there's an attempt. I'm not saying it's perfect. There's an attempt to organize from bottom up. And the reason is to have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, confederalist foundation. Now, I think this is from below to top, but I think we also need structures that are above that, because, you know, with the coronavirus, with the structures of racism and colonialism, it has become even more apparent that the problems that we're facing are global. So obviously we need to have a confederalist model that is, again, this time above the nation state level, so that we can collectively address those problems. But until, right, that is established, then we do have the reality of geopolitical power relations, and we do have the reality of the nation state. And so with that, I think Kamran is right, some common denominators, but at the same time, some principles that the movements cannot give up. For example, after 50 years of struggle, I think Kurdish movements in any cooperation, in any, at least the ones that, you know, we have seen in Bakur and Syria, that they would not give up on the idea of co-presidency, of the feminist principles that is based around the quota system. So this might not be a common denominator. And right now they're not imposing it on, for example, the Arab societies in the northeast Syria that want to, you know, the sheikhs and the leaders that want to rule otherwise. It's not imposed on them, but these are things that need to be discussed. And the idea is the more Arab women get involved in that bottom-up grassroots decision-making process in the women's houses and other places, that the more the societies will transform themselves. So I think, you know, these common denominators, but at the same time, some principles that the movements cannot give up on, such as decolonization, such as, you know, obviously, I'm not rejecting the fact that the Kurds and Kurdish movements should self-critique. That has been actually, at least ideologically on the paper, one of the most important tenets that they wanted to develop in their movements. But I think this becomes more critical on the side of the societies that they have, that they believe to be, that they are the oppressors, right, of the Kurdish population. So that level of self-critique and constant check-in from the point of the oppressor is very important in this.
Thank you. Dlshad, any final remarks?
Absolutely. I think I just wrote a couple ideas that I think might to re-engage this topic and conversation again. And I think number one is to believe that Kurds are actually oppressed. They are not the oppressor. And recently, with Kurds gaining power into their cities and towns and villages, this image that Kurds are the new oppressor is taking over. And I think this is really wrong. Fighting for our rights does not make us oppressors. So I think this is a very foundational idea that people need to rethink about. I think the second idea is the respect the right of self-determination. If Kurds decided that they don't want to live under Syria or under Iraq or Turkey, it's just, you should respect this right, and it's not a threat to you personally. And I think it needs more discussion on how this can happen, but I think just the basics of respecting the idea will open the door for a lot of discussions and conversations that might actually eliminate the whole idea, which I think is in our modern day a very big possibility. And I think also the third point is understanding that specific political alignments might makes you lose local components of your people. And this applies to Syrian opposition. I mean, when you ally with Turkey and you became a tool in their hands, you are going to lose your fellow Syrians, Kurds, and there is no way around it. So understanding the risk that you're taking and specific games that you decided to play, this will also help understand the future of this relationship. The Kurds are bringing a lot of ideas to, political ideas to, what might be the solution for Syria. But no one is really opening their minds and listening to that. What's happening in Eastern Euphrates is really a unique experience. Arabs, Kurds, Christians, and different other ethno-religious minorities are working together. This is a model. Why not applying this to all Syria? So just be open-minded to whatever Kurds are bringing or to the table as a political solutions. And I think the main issue which really can help solve all what we talked about is re-engage the discussion about identity. What is identities within our own societies? In my experience, being active within the Syrian Revolution space for years, majority of people are just rebranding what Al-Ba'ath brought or created as an identity for Syria. Just rebranding it. They're saying, hey, this is the new post-2011 identity of Syria, which is just what Al-Ba'ath brought, really. Rejecting the idea of removing the word Arab, as Kamran mentioned, from the name of Syria is a great example. And this is the foundation of Al-Ba'ath ideology and how they are viewing Syrian identity. And I think these are the main topics which can really reignite the conversation between different elements. And I think it applies to Iraq and Turkey, because Kurdish issue is almost identical in all four parts.
Thank you so much for a very inspiring and spirited debate about these questions. And my apologies again for losing Thomas. I think his internet connection was not very good. And I would like also to announce our next panel, Syria and the Second Wave of Revolution in the MENA region. And that's Saturday, July 25th at 2 as well, sponsored by Haymarket and Twitter Press. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.